Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome to this evening's BIC hybrid, technically, session of Breaking Free, the age-old question of when are we old enough? A new series which is all about listening to young adults. So this is our newest venture from BIC, a series of conversations by the youth on the BIC platform, which is conceived, planned, and executed by young people in the age bracket of 17 or 16 to 22. And we are really excited uh, about being flies, lizards, and other critters on the wall to these conversations where we get a little bit of a glimpse of what the youth are really thinking. And when I say youth, I wish somebody were listening to me when about a decade and a half ago. And I have great hope for this bright young group. And we hope that a lot more of you come forward and share your thoughts, hopes, dreams, and also complaints are welcome. And we have with us a young group consisting of Tia, who I first met as a 7-year-old, and now she's taller than me. Uh, and there's Sanjit, who gave us this idea, came up to us at BIC and instigated the whole thing. There's Sahil, Arya, and Anya, who have come up together and given us a boatload of ideas, and which we can't wait to share with all of you. And with that, no, before I hand it over to Sanjit, please post your questions in the Q&A box, which you see at the bottom of your screen. And all conversations and queries and comments are welcome. And with that, over to you, Sanjit.
All right. Thank you, Leka, for that. So, hey everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining this session today. I'm Sanjit Rao, and I'll be the moderator and instigator for this debate, or rather, a discussion, a term I prefer. So, at a time when Gitanjali Rao makes international headlines for being named as Time magazine's first ever Kid of the Year, it further affirms our belief that kids, or rather young adults, a term that I prefer, be included in discussions, make our voices heard, our opinions understood, and be involved on a public platform. For this, I'm extremely grateful and indebted to the Bangalore International Center, who not only lent me a listening ear about a month ago when I approached them, but have been extremely interested and allowed me to manifest this into a series along with their help, of course. We have a couple of episodes planned for the future, but today we shall begin with the age old existential question, which I believe will set the stage and set the ball rolling. When are we old enough? Without further ado, let me introduce the panelists for today. We have Anya, a first year university student of law. Her interests include the intersection between technology and law, food and fitness, and the future of humanity. We have Arya, a grade 11 student with a passion for life sciences. Sahil, a computer science and debate enthusiast, and Tia, who is a 17-year-old animal lover and public speaker. Let me begin by informing you about the format for today's discussion. Till the end of the hour, we will have a discussion, and afterwards, we will be entertaining questions from the audience. So please do send us your questions, and we'll be more than happy to try and answer them, or to at least give our point of view about whatever you have in mind. With that, let me invite the first speaker, Anya, to give her opening remarks for today.
Thank you for the introduction, Sanjit. I'm in equal parts excited and grateful to be a part of this discussion. I think what fascinates me the most about this topic is rather a dilemma between privacy and safety with respect to teenagers. I think this dilemma becomes even more pronounced in the 21st century when like teens have unfettered access to technology, and this is an aspect of the broader topic that that I hope to engage with at the end of this panel.
Thank you, Anya, for those opening remarks. Over to Sahil.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sanjit, for introducing me. Yeah, I'm a bit nervous. This is the first time I'm participating in a panel discussion, but I hope I don't make too many slip-ups. I would really like to thank, first of all, BIC for giving us this opportunity. I think it's rare that organizations give teenagers and young adults a voice and a platform. And I think it's a great initiative that they've taken up. And I'm really grateful that I was one of the few who were invited for this. So thank you so much. As someone who is really interested in technology and computer science, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the issue that I would like to bring up is when our teenagers or young adults mature enough to make decisions about their use of technology. This could be anything from the amount of time they spend on their computers or their phones to what apps they're using, what games they play. Things like these, I think, are even more relevant in today's time when kids are clamoring to kind of jumping from one app to the other and one service to the other. And I think it can be a really confusing time for parents because technology moves so fast. So I'd really like to share our perspective on this as teenagers, and hopefully we can help you learn something new as well. So thank you.
All right, so I'll thank you for those opening remarks. Over to Arya. What do you think about the topic breaking free, and what would you like to discuss in our discussion today?
So firstly, thank you so much, Sanjit, and thank you, BIC, as Sahil mentioned. I think I'd like to provide my perspective on what autonomy does to a teenager's development as a human being. I think it's important to figure out why exactly teenagers want autonomy and why it's important to them, and maybe also explore the biological or psychological aspects of that a little bit. And then I'd also love to discuss how that translates into society and culture. What are the cultural differences that affect how much autonomy is given to how much autonomy is given to teenagers, and maybe also explore the relationship between financial self-sufficiency and autonomy, and how different degrees of autonomy can affect how a person deals with their life as a whole.
All right. So I think that's a really interesting point that he raised, and we will be talking about this later, about financial dependency and autonomy. Should teenagers, should young adults have the right to be completely autonomous after a certain age group, um, irrespective of whether they're still financially dependent on their parents or not? And I think we should come back to this later. But before we go ahead, Tia, what would you like to address in today's discussion?
Like everyone before me said, thank you, VIC, for giving us a platform where we can talk about this. And I think it's about time where we have young voices giving their interpretation of what is going on in society. And I think ever since I was little, I've always questioned like status quo in society and why things are a certain way. So one of the things I'm quite interested in is when are young adults old enough to choose who they want to be in society, where they want to fit in, what role they want to play, at what age do they get to make that decision for themselves instead of following what their family or their parents set out for them. And another thing is, I think because I've grown up, both my parents are lawyers. So another thing that I'm quite interested to talk about is whether laws like in India especially still apply to young adults when we look at it logically, like the drinking age, driving age, the age of marriage and whatnot, like whether they still apply logically to young adults.
All right. So thank you for those opening remarks. So now let's try and understand a little bit more about what our panelists have been mentioning today. So Anya, let me start with you since you were the first one to speak and introduce what you wanted to talk about. So you spoke a bit about privacy and safety and trying to draw a line or trying to compromise. So what do you think would be a fair compromise with respect to this, and what exactly do you envision, or rather how would you describe the problem, the situation, and probably even a solution if there's a really big problem with respect to it?
Thank you, Sanjit. So I think we need to, when I talk about like privacy and teenagers. Teenagers are constantly wanting, the adolescent brain is always wanting to struggle, like there's always a struggle for power and struggle for autonomy when you live in like a cohabitance with your like parents or like caregivers or guardians for that matter. So I think there's this dilemma that most of us are stuck in and confused between whether we want how much privacy should a child or a teenager or an adolescent have when it comes to like compromising their safety. Because I think my parents, when I say this, I speak with like first-hand knowledge of the fact that my parents would be willing to compromise my privacy at times when it comes to my safety. So I think an established premise on which I would like to form my argument is that parents, guardians, caregivers want their wards to be safe. And it is a dangerous world out there. So that's like fair on their part. And it is dangerous, and we understand that's true. However, we need to use our time and we need to train our children how to be able to adapt to this world which is dangerous, rather than taking the easy way out, which is to like spy on them as a substitute for teaching them how to interact with the world. And I think this is like the key contention and a point of disagreement that I often have with my parents, is that instead of teaching me how to interact with my external environment and how to behave and how private I should be online and how much I should share online, it's more like a top-down approach where they just tell me like, okay, this is non-negotiable, cannot be done, and therefore I think there's a lack of communication as to what constitutes as appropriate behavior in order to interact with my society, with my external environment. I think it's important for adults or like any caregiver or parent to understand that privacy isn't about secrecy, it's about autonomy. It's crucial to understand that wanting privacy doesn't have to do with the fact that I have to hide something. It just means that I want to have this sense of independence and liberty, which I think comes with having a sense of which comes with having a sense of privacy. And independence is a necessary skill. I think it lets us control how much information about ourselves that we want other people to have. And I think, and if I were to be provocative, that is to say that the moment we start normalizing these privacy breaches in our lives, in our daily interactions, we sort of give away a lot of power that we as individuals have. And think of it like, and if I were to be really provocative with this, think of it like the state, right? We're conditioning people not to be able to handle their own privacy. And if we don't train teenagers at this point in time to be able to handle this, one of the biggest concerns I have is that if you over nanny state the situation, children are constantly used to parents spying on them, to the point at which they think it's normal to have like a big brother like situation in your life. And I think that's particularly problematic in the digital age. So these are my thoughts. I really want to know what the rest of the panelists think about this.
Yeah, so I think really valid points, and especially when you said privacy isn't about secrecy, but it's about autonomy. That made a lot of sense. As an 18-year-old myself, that also applies to me, and I completely resonate your views. But before I allow the rest of the panel to react to what you said, I have a question. It's a bit of a dilemma. For example, let's assume hypothetically that someone's parents were extremely conservative. They were probably not going to be in favor of a teen relationship. And we know that often teen relationships can be a cause for a lot of safety breaches in various different aspects. It can be emotional, it could be physical, it could be sexual, it could be in many different types. So my question to you would be that when you cannot be upfront with your parents about certain things, and when you know that they at the end of the day have your best interests in mind, that's your safety, how do you decide whether you should probably tell them about your relationship or not, or keep it a secret from them or not? Because you know that their reaction may not always be pleasant, especially if they're what our generation calls conservative in nature. So what do you do in this sort of situation?
I think it's important to understand that perfect solution to this is, but it's important to understand that if you refuse to give your child that autonomy, if you refuse to give your child that element of privacy in their life, we're sort of teaching our children how to lie, because researchers have looked at this, and it's called the Hawthorne effect, right? I can tell you not to do something, but you're going to do it anyway, right? So for temporarily, I'll modify my behavior to appease to you, and I'm lying in order, and I'm learning how to, because lying is a taught skill, and I'm learning how to lie and modify my behavior in order to appease to my parental guidance, instead of being open with them and telling them that, look, I'm in a relationship, and like, these are the things that I expect out of it. So it's sort of inevitable in the sense that children are going to modify their behavior temporarily if their parents aren't okay with it, because if you're going to have a top down approach and not teach them how to interact with their external environment, there is no way that there's no way that they're going to just take your bottom, like, top down approach of saying, no, this is off the table, and accepting that as their truth, because we're constantly being taught how to challenge our existing beliefs, especially in the digital age, because you're exposed to so much more and not just what your parents believe is right or wrong. So I think that creates a potentially dangerous situation in terms of how your relationship with your parents could look, because it's sort of it's a very difficult position that the parents are going to put themselves in, because if you're constantly having like this surveilling authority telling you how to interact with your external environment, you're going to have, like, children are going to resort to the Hawthorne effect, and we're creating a generation of liars, and I think that's inherently dangerous, and I don't need to tell you why.
All right, really valid point. So at this point, would any of the other panelists like to chip in with their comments or views?
If I could go ahead.
Yes, please.
I think personally, I don't think privacy and safety have to be like mutually exclusive. I think when parenting is done right, and when a child grows up in an environment where they do feel safe, it's not privacy or safety, but it's more of privacy and safety. Like you said, like, privacy doesn't mean secrecy. Privacy means giving your children their own space to do what they're doing, while still knowing that they're being safe, while still knowing they're not putting themselves in danger. And I think that also comes in when you know you trust your child. I think that privacy comes only with trust. So I think parents also need to learn to step back and have faith in their own parenting, to know that that child can make decisions that are right, that can, know between right and wrong. I think parents should start focusing on teaching their children how to make those decisions for themselves instead of taking them for their children. I think when your child knows that you have faith that they will choose to do the right thing and give them the space to make those mistakes, then your children will also come to you and be more open with you, and have like that, you like, your relationship changes. It's no more of like, it's not like a, I, like how Anya said, it doesn't become a, I need to lie to you, or I need to like be a different person around you because I fear that you won't support what I'm doing. But it becomes more of, I'm confiding in you. I know that if something does go wrong, I can still come to you. So I think when that trust exists, privacy and safety are no more like mutually exclusive, but they come hand in hand.
Absolutely. So I think a key takeaway from this, at least from what I can see, is it shouldn't be a privacy or safety situation, but rather, um, as young adults, you'd all prefer if it's a privacy and safety sort of situation. So that there's no dilemma that any of us are put in, or any people younger than my age, or younger than me, or a little older than me are put in. So that's extremely valid. So unless any of the other panelists would like to add anything, yes,
Yeah, could I just pitch in a quick point? So I like how Tia brought up the aspect of trust. And I just wanted to talk about how I think that trust can sometimes break down in a relationship between a parent and a child. I think we focused a lot on how over restrictions by parents can break down that trust. But I think that trust can also be broken down from the child's side. I think if if a parent has put in the trust in a kid to kind of given them freedoms and expected them to take the responsibilities that come along with those freedoms, and they see that um, the child is abusing those freedoms in a way and um, not understanding the responsibility aspect that comes with those freedoms, I think then that can also cause like a reactionary thing from the parent side as well. And actually, I think it's kind of almost like a vicious cycle. And the question is, where does the cycle start, right? Because once, if it starts, it could start from the parents being overbearing, or it could start from the children breaking the trust that the parents have put in them. But once that cycle starts, I feel like it's very easy for that cycle to escalate very quickly. And I think that just understanding that it comes from both sides, and I think that's an important nuance.
Right. So I think Silas raised a very valid point about trust being a two-way street. So it cannot be broken, and nothing wrong should be done if one expects it to be given or received, which I think makes a lot of sense. So now, Sahil, let's continue with you itself. And you were talking about teenagers and the consumption of technology and social media. So could you just probably explain it a little bit more and tell us what you think about it?
Sure. Um, so I think this issue is kind of rooted in the fact. So if anyone in the audience has watched the documentary The Social Dilemma on Netflix, I'll be referring to points raised on that quite a bit, but like also trying to put some of my own perspectives into that. Um, and I think the reason that this generation is kind of the first to deal with this problem on a large scale is because we are the first generation to have grown up with social media. Um, every generation before us has had technology in some aspect or the other, but we are certainly the first generation that has been raised with social media. And I think that puts us in a very special position to kind of understand the impact that that has on youth, because this has never been an issue before. Um, and I think what really distinguishes social media from older types of technology or technology that we've had in the past is that social media is not just designed as a tool, it is designed to be addictive. It is designed to hook a user in, and it's designed to keep a user coming. So for example, if you think about a toaster does not have any incentive to keep you using the toaster every day, right? The toaster is just there to toast your bread, and once you toast your bread, you're done. But that's not how social media works, because social media inherently works on advertisements and therefore has incentive to keep you coming every day and every hour and as often as it can. And I think this difference in the relationship between technology and users has kind of shifted the dynamic. And because of that, I think a lot of people haven't fully adjusted to what the consequences of this are. And I think this is especially important in youth, because there's a lot of work that shows that obviously youth are impressionable. This is something that gets thrown around a lot. And in these developmental stages of life, addictions are much, much easier to form. It is uh, children and teenagers have less self-control because their brains are still developing. It is very easy for them to get addicted to the kind of dopamine that social media feeds off of. And I think that that's something that has to be kept in mind when considering this issue. Um, because obviously social media is a very easy way to distract children, right? Um, I've seen myself that when we go to restaurants these days, sometimes families will just prop up their phone in front of the child to stop them from complaining. It's the easy way out. But I think it's also important to consider what the long-lasting effects of behavior such as this can be, and where is it that. But at the same time, you parents also have to draw the line somewhere, but they also have to give their children enough freedom to make those decisions. Otherwise, A, how can they trust children to make those decisions when the parents are no longer around? And B, um, being overbearing about such decisions can cause the risk of uh, like creating a rebellious kind of spirit in kids, which is obviously not something you want, because like Anya and Tia brought up in the previous thing, this leads to break in trust, it leads to like lying, and these are things that obviously all families want to avoid. So I think these are like kind of the nuances of the question that I wanted to bring up and discuss in the conversation.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you for that. I think you've put it into really good context, and you're absolutely right when you say we are the first generation to be raised alongside social media and how important it is in our lives today. So I have a question which can probably be divided into two parts. One is, how would you regulate social media consumption? Like, probably hypothetically, if you have a family, or if you are the head of your family and you decide how long your children can use social media, how would you regulate it? And second, and this is a little more complex, so social media can be used by even teenagers today in really productive manners. You see some businesses that have sprung up. You see influencers who are probably even younger than all of us on the panel, making a lot of money, getting a lot of fame along with it. And it's sometimes social media is something that parents not comprehend well. So we've recently seen the manner in which, for example, TikTok has become so famous, with millions and millions of people our age taking to it and expressing themselves, their creativity through that platform, which is often seen as a waste of time. So do you think it's a waste of time? Do you think it's all about the addiction and the even I've watched the documentary you mentioned, The Social Dilemma, and I was really shocked by it, to be honest. So do you think it's all about that and the bad aspects of technology, or do you think that technology has some sort of merit and it's also beneficial and holds a really good place in society today?
Sure. Thanks, Sanjit. So addressing your first point, I think the important distinction to draw here is that teenagers don't want to be addicted to social media either. I think this is a common misconception, that teenagers just love social media and they like it so much that they don't want to give it up. I think this is untrue. From all the conversations I've had with people who actually think they are addicted to social media hate it. They're like, I wish I wasn't. I wish I was more productive. I wish I could get off this app and start doing like other things with my life that I want to do. So I think and I think that's important for parents to understand as well, that your kids are with you in this fight. You are fighting this with them. It's not like they they actively like this thing so much that they want to stick to it and waste on their all their time on it. I don't think that's true. And I think because of that, one of the most effective ways to kind of combat like addiction and spending too much time on it is helping us understand how much time we're spending on it. Because I think one of the biggest issues is that sometimes people just don't realize how much time they're spending. For example, I thought I wasn't spending time on Instagram, and then I checked my Instagram usage stats, and it was like 2 to 3 hours a day, which is ridiculous. And I came to realize that I've just been opening it and scrolling through it when I have nothing to do. And I think that realization, once that realization occurs, and once the kid also understands that this is an issue, which they will, it's not like they want to be unproductive. I think once everyone comes to the same realization and everyone understands that there is an issue, I think that's when you can start fighting it together. Because I think when regulation comes from an outside space and you don't understand why that regulation is being put on you, it becomes more of a us versus them kind of situation. But if everyone is in agreement that it is an issue and this is something that everyone's trying to combat together, then I think that gets a lot easier. So it can be simple things like installing apps on your phone that track which apps you're using how often, or how often you're using your phone in a day. I don't think it's productive for parents to forcefully limit the amount of hours on your phone. I think that will cause more like conflict than anything else. But I think if a parent and a child agree that certain limits should be put, then that's fine. But I think just making everyone aware that this is the amount of time they're spending, and also understanding that maybe 1 or 2 hours a day is not necessarily that horrible of a thing. It's kind of like just making sure that it's not taking time away from things that are more important to you. And I think the important thing to understand is teenagers want it to, that it's not you are fighting against them. They also want to break out of the cycle. Um, and for the second point, I'm sorry I've taken up a lot of time. I'll quickly just run through my opinions on that. I definitely agree that social media is so beneficial. I think we are looking at the negatives of social media from the lens of having the convenience of it. And I think if the convenience was taken away, then we'd start to understand what we have lost. It's kind of like the situation where until you have it, you don't realize how much you're gaining from it. There are so many examples I can give. The Arab Spring would have been impossible without the use of social media, for example. And that's like huge examples, but even small examples like communicating with friends and family on lockdown. I've celebrated my grandparents' birthday on a Zoom call, and that was amazing because we got to catch up with everyone, which only usually happens on shadis like once every 2 years. So like it's things like this, and I think the lockdown has also made people appreciate the positive effects of social media a lot more in our day-to-day lives, and how much it helps us connect with the people around us. So I think that it's definitely not viable or even not beneficial to completely block it out of our lives. I think that that's counterproductive and kind of going against the point of what the goal is. I think the goal is just to make sure it doesn't take over our lives, and to make sure that we are aware of how much time we are spending on it, and aware of the impact it's having on us, so that we can control that to some extent.
Right. So I think, like you said, self-awareness is really important, and even knowing all about how your data is being used is important. Because for a very long time, I say this with a lot of regret, to be honest. I used to think, okay, so what if Facebook has my data? So what if Instagram has my data? But after watching the social dilemma, at the risk of repeating myself, it really changed the way I thought. And I think it really made me more aware of what I was doing online, and how probably I was being targeted with certain articles or advertisements. And I think you're absolutely right when you say self-awareness is the most important. And if you can start off by even installing an app, or I think nowadays most phones, if you go to the settings, you can see your daily screen time. And on apps like Instagram, YouTube, you can even see or how many hours you spent in that particular app. And I think it begins with over there. You're absolutely right when you say that. Does anyone want to chip in?
Yeah, actually, I did want to say one thing. I completely agree with everything that both Sanjit and Sahil have mentioned. There's just one thing I want to add. I don't believe that social media addiction is the same as social media usage. I think addiction is a very specific problem that comes across when there's some other underlying problem. Addiction is generally people filling a void for something else. So it might arise for any number of reasons. It might arise for some sort of self-esteem issues. It might arise due to social disconnect. It might arise due to a feeling of not having a purpose. It could any number of reasons. But I do believe that while social media can worsen a spiral, a downward spiral, it doesn't necessarily initiate it. And I think that's something important for both teenagers and adults to realize, that quite often the underlying causes for these things are very different than just the amount of time people are using on social media. It's also what you're doing on social media, whether you're cutting yourself off from other people, whether social media is helping feed into some sort of low self-esteem or any sort of complex that you have, and whether it's facilitating a downward spiral or it's just a coping mechanism that might actually be beneficial to you. And I think a lot of this a lot of that is not something that people might necessarily know. It's not something that either teenagers or adults might be aware about themselves. But I think it's something important to keep in mind while considering the issue of social media usage.
Right. Sahil, do you want to respond to that probably?
No, I just, yeah, thanks Arya for clarifying. I think addiction is a very strong word, and kind of starts feeding into the medical usage of the word, which is maybe not what I should have used there. Maybe it's more, should be more like habitual use, or use that um, you feel like is too much. I think addiction is a more medical issue that needs to be handled by experts. Um, and that's like a completely different issue that maybe I should not be considering in this discussion specifically. So yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
I mean, I don't think it's anything as rigid as that. I think addiction is it's just when it becomes compulsive and when it starts affecting your ability to function normally in day-to-day activities.
If I could add something, Sandra, sorry. No, but like when Sahil was talking about how he like opened his screen time and he saw his Instagram was like 2 hours, I think that's something that I think it's worsened over lockdown, especially because I had a good friend of mine telling me that like we were on call and he mentioned that every time we weren't speaking, I'd open Instagram and just scroll through it, even if it was like liking 2, 3 posts. And it's become such a reflex action that I didn't even notice it until he mentioned it, which is scary to a certain extent. But I think when we talk about whether technology is good, I think younger generations get a lot of backlash on the amount of technology that we use. But I mean, I think over lockdown, like Sahil said, everyone's come to appreciate it. I mean, we're having this conference over Zoom, we're being able to talk about these things. I had my exams over Google Meet. So I think it's how you use technology, what you're getting out of it, and like moderation of it. That's the most important thing. And I think that comes with everything. Anything in excess becomes bad. Anything in excess is not good. So when we talk about technology, I think in moderation, it's helping all of us in ways that you can't even explain.
You know, Tia, if I may, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that during lockdown specifically, people have started using a lot more social media, because
Yeah.
I think that's sort of evidence of an underlying cause in and of itself. I mean,
Yeah,
the reason
exactly.
people
Yeah.
are using so much social media now is because we don't have any other forms of engagement. We don't have any forms of stimulation, not interacting with each other as much. A lot of people aren't even stepping out of their house.
Exactly.
And I think it's important to consider those and not just the issue of, oh, social media bad.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not just that over lockdown we're all using it a lot more. It's that our social interaction in person has reduced. I'm not going out and meeting friends. I'm not going to Carbon Park and taking a walk. Instead, I'm having to substitute that time with scrolling through Instagram or messaging people on Snapchat. So when I open my screen time, I'm spending more than half of my day on like my phone, which is absolutely scary. But like you mentioned, there's an underlying reason for it.
And it can be both a good and bad thing. It
Yeah,
can be good if it's helping you connect with people and
exactly.
substituting the social engagement, but it can also be bad if it's just taking up all of your time,
Time,
resulting
yeah,
in
if it's just
monotony. Yeah,
wasting it,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. I think it's a fine line that
It
each
is.
person needs to find that balance for themselves.
And that's where individual choice comes in,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right. So I think at the end of the day, it's about drawing a line and understanding when you step over that line and probably trying to not step over that line. So if it's 12 hours a day on Instagram, probably a bad, unless that's your job and you're making, probably you're being able to fund yourself through that. Which brings me to my next question, and addressing this to Arya. You spoke a bit about financial dependence and autonomy and self-sufficiency. So what do you have to say about that? What do you think about it?
So, firstly, I'd like to talk about a few arguments that people tend to provide on this topic. I've heard a lot of people say things like, "Oh, I mean, jokingly say things like, "Oh, you can get a boyfriend when you have a stable job," and stuff like that. Um, just generally, a lot of people tend to link autonomy to financial sufficiency. People tend to assume that when you are financially sufficient, at that point, you can then start to make your own decisions. And while I think this might be true to a certain extent with a certain limited number of factors, like things like spending, what you choose to spend on, what you choose to buy, I don't think this should be true for autonomy as a whole and for the decisions an individual can make as a whole. Because very simply, I think, as Anya mentioned, a lot of our learning as teenagers, we learn a lot about how to function as adults during our teenage phase. Those thought processes and those neural pathways are formed in our teenage years before we are financially sufficient. And to wait till after you are financially sufficient to actually learn to be autonomous and to learn how to take care of yourself, I think that can be quite damaging. Um, so just to go into the sort of development of a person's mind, as children, as young children, people tend to want a lot of security and a lot of certainty and a lot of guidance, which is why generally kids tend to ask for permission for a lot of things. Parents tend to be a lot more restrictive of young children, and rightfully so, because they are children. They require that amount of guidance, mostly because they neither have quite most of the time they neither have the will nor the ability to make their own decisions. But what starts happening as people age and once they get into their adolescence, and people essentially start wanting a greater degree of autonomy. It is not just a mental thing, it is very literally a biological thing. That is how humans are adapted. It's actually, it's a process called, I think it's called individuation in psychology, where a person essentially separates their identity from the identity of their parents and their family and starts forming their own identity as an individual. And a lot of behaviors that are associated with teenagers, a lot of the supposedly irrational behaviors of teenagers, stuff like risk taking, stuff like rebelliousness, stuff like losing interest in certain things that they used to be interested in, or disconnecting themselves from family. A lot of those things actually arise from these impulses to separate themselves from their parents and to become an adult. And this is actually a completely natural process. This is essentially how all people learn how to be adults, right? Learn how to function in the adult world. But unfortunately, as a lot of people mentioned, the result of this, it can have several negative consequences, like the risk-taking behavior. It can put a person at risk of things like car accidents, driving fast. There's a lot of that in teenagers. Also things like drinking excessively, and just any other sort of safety breaches that teenagers can express. Rebelliousness can sometimes lead to a disconnect with the family. It can sometimes lead to people even taking self-sabotaging behavior in the name of rebelliousness. I think Sahil touched upon that. And I think the main thrust of autonomy is, or the main thrust of parenting should be to provide information and to support while still allowing a certain degree of autonomy. Now, I agree that this is a bit of it's not exactly a very concrete line to draw. I don't presume to give parenting advice over here. I'd just like to explore, I guess, where the boundary can be drawn and the implications of that boundary. So I think a lot of differences in autonomy arise between cultures, right? A lot of people provide excuses like saying things like, "Oh, in Western culture, people are independent at a younger age, but that's not aligned with traditional Indian values." And it is true. A lot of things that are acceptable in the West might not necessarily seem acceptable in India at first. Like, for example, the driving age in the US, I think, is 16. And the drinking age in a lot of European countries is also 16. That might not necessarily seem acceptable in India or in Indian culture. But I do also believe that it's not just cultural. A lot of it is innate. Things like the desire for independence that I just touched upon, that is innate, that happens on its own. It's not the impact of social media or Western culture or anything when teenagers want to have their own identity, or at least in my opinion. And another thing that's also touched upon that people tend to make a cultural thing when it's not actually a cultural thing is sex or sexual development or romance. I think it's a very normal part of every teenager's life to start being interested in the opposite sex and to start being interested in romance. And a lot of people, especially people who tend to have more conservative outlooks, tend to be opposed to this in teenagers. I believe that this can be a little bit damaging because we form a sexual identity during our teenage years. A lot of what we figure out about how we respond to the opposite sex, a lot of that is formed during our teenage years, during the time when arguably the sex drive is highest and where all the neural pathways are being formed. And I think repressing that during the teenage years can sometimes have negative consequences. Arguably, people say that India has a rape culture. And I think in part that is facilitated by the fact that there is no clear, like, consent in Indian culture hasn't really been ingrained from the youth, at least in a lot of cases. It hasn't been ingrained properly from the time that people are young, or people tend to oppose that. And what that means is a lot of people they haven't yet entirely formed established the proper ways of dealing with sexual urges, or of saying no, or sexual safety, or any of those important things that teenagers should normally be learning, but they might not necessarily be learning. I think there is, of course, a flip side to it. a lot of experimentation that happens when you're a teenager can be damaging to a person themselves. And it's not just with regards to sexual matters, it can also be with regards to substance, with regards to driving too early. A lot of that can be very damaging to a person's safety. So to sort of touch upon points that other people have brought up already, I think it's about striking a balance between allowing a child to learn at their own pace and to figure things out for themselves while still putting enough limits or providing enough information for the child to make informed decisions and to not fall into negative patterns despite normal teenage risk-taking behavior. I don't think it's entirely possible to completely stifle risk-taking behavior. That is just a very normal and unfortunate part of growing up as an adult. I think it's more about providing enough information to sort of go through all the risk-taking phases, figure things out while not damaging yourself too much.
Yeah, I think really, I like the new streams you added to this discussion, especially about the want for autonomy being biological and stuff like that. Now, you spoke a little bit of culture, and you said that it does play a role because probably in the West, and you gave a couple of examples about that. So, my question to you would be: do you think that when usually in the West they have a more liberal culture towards a whole bunch of issues from driving to drinking and whatnot. Do you think that when they have it so liberal and when we sitting in probably a country like India, which is a little more conservative, and but at the same time we are exposed to a lot of those Western liberal ideas, and we probably we see through movies, through pop culture, the sort of lives that our counterparts in other Western countries are leading, and we sort of feel, okay, if they can do it, why can't we do it? Or probably if we go and visit another country or have had the opportunity to live there, we see how relaxed they are about a whole bunch of things. So don't you think that even that plays a role? And do you think that that role in influencing our thoughts is valid? Because can I sit in India and in Karnataka, we're all in Bangalore today, and can I say that the drinking age of 21 is too high? Because I can probably take a flight and go to Goa where I'm legal. Or we don't even have to think about going as far as a Western country. You can just go to a different union territory or a state and you're suddenly legal over there. Or you can drive down to Pondicherry and you're legal over there. So do you think that this culture really plays an important role in only understanding, or do you think that it's fair to even say that we can be influenced by that culture despite living in a culture which does not agree or respect those beliefs and values?
I think that is absolutely valid. And I think what's really important for a lot of us to realize is that Indian culture, well, arguably the culture of every country in the world, but especially Indian culture, is changing today at a faster rate than it has ever changed in the past, I'd argue, with the exception of maybe major events such as decolonization and stuff like that. Right now, with the amount of globalization that's happening, Indian culture is changing. It's modernizing. It could be for the better, it could be for the worse. And I think that affects a lot of things, among them the expectations of the youth, like you mentioned, how much autonomy they want, how much autonomy might be worth providing them. And I think that is really where the need for kids to be able to make their own decisions regarding these things comes into play. To some extent, and with all due respect, I think with regards to certain things, the experience of past generations, while it might have served many, many generations well, might not necessarily serve our generation well. A lot of ideas about, just because romance was touched upon, a lot of ideas about romance, a lot of ideas also about when and at what pace a kid learns about their academics, at what pace a kid decides their career path. A lot of those things that would normally happen at a later age are happening at an earlier age now due to the changing culture. And I guess that's really where knowing your child is important. I think for a parent, I think it's important for a parent to know their child's capabilities, their child's desires, what their child needs, what's probably best for their child, and not to just fall into this preconceived notion of what parenting is or what a kid is. I think it's important for people to appreciate that, yes, it is a changing culture. What works for this generation might not necessarily have been what works for previous generations. And I guess to provide teenagers this degree of autonomy to decide what they want from their lives or what they would like from the world as a whole. You specifically mentioned things like the drinking age and the driving age. I think those are important things. That's on a more legal aspect, but I do actually believe that in future years, possibly the driving age in other countries may be reversed. The drinking age in various union territories might be evened out. Like we might have a single drinking age for the entire country. I do believe those sort of things are going to be in review. They are going to change, and that's just natural because cultures change. Globalization is changing cultures. Modernization is changing cultures, and um, I guess it's important for everyone, both teenagers and parents, to be aware of that.
Right. So, yeah, that does make sense. And I think we can just hope that with time, these cultures are accepted, although it often takes frustratingly long. Um, we can only hope for the best, I guess. Do any of the other panelists want to pitch in at this?
Just a quick thing. I just wanted to say, um, coming from a generation which is exposed to a lot of global ideas, I think we also maybe do not have as great of a perspective on what Indian culture exactly entails. I know that a lot of the audience may be older than us. And if you guys would like to offer your opinions through the questions on what you think maybe because I don't think it's fair to say that it's a black and white issue, right? I think there are a lot of things from Indian culture and Eastern culture in general that is important. And I think just overriding that is kind of looking at it in a very one-sided way. So I'd love to hear from the kind of adults watching and the attendees on what they think are aspects of Indian culture that they feel are a lot more justifiable, or and why, if they'd like to hear our opinions on some of those things, that would be interesting, I think.
Right. So absolutely. So we are going to have a Q&A session during which our attendees can unmute themselves and ask us questions, give us their comments and opinions. So please do that. In the meantime, if you're not interested in unmuting yourself, you can send in your questions through the Q&A option or through chat if that has been enabled. I'm not sure about that. So otherwise, you can just use the Q&A section. And yeah, so please do. And because the entire point of this discussion is for it to not only be between teenagers, between 17 to 19-year-olds on the panel, but also involve the older generation and get their points of view, because we may have missed something out that people older than us might have thought about. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session as well. Before moving into that, Tia, so you spoke about a whole bunch of issues in your opening remarks. So you spoke about the drinking age laws, about stark differences, and about when one can form their own identity. So what would you like to say about that?
I mean, starting off with like when people form their own identity, I think this is something that I feel strongly about just because I have a lot of friends who run into this dilemma where they have very different views and opinions of their life, what they believe in, than their parents, which is normal. I think generational gaps will always exist. And no matter how much you try to bridge it, it's always there. But I think it becomes an issue when you have parents that don't allow their children to have their own identity. Now, this identity might be like how Arya brought up your sexual identity, or just your identity as who you are in society, whether you want to be like like a in like social words which aren't actually like socially correct, but like quirky or normal in society, like who you want to be in society, where you want to fit in. When are you as a child allowed to make that decision? I think that's something that maybe all of us face. You'll always have, like, in some situation or the other, your parents telling you, don't do this, people will say this about it, or don't act like this in a certain situation, which is them socializing us to fit into society's norms. But when am I allowed to choose what norms I do want to align with and what norms I feel just are obsolete and don't make any sense? When am I allowed to make those decisions on like my own? And I think as and when we went through this discussion, I noticed how all the issues that all of us brought up are linked together. Like, am I allowed to make these decisions only when I'm financially stable? Or how Arya brought up that, like our cultures are changing so much, and that links back to social media. Cultural diffusion is happening so much because of technology, because we're sitting in India and we're allowed to, like, we have the ability to watch American, British, Australian shows where we're exposed to Western culture. So I think that also changes our identity too when we're exposed to different cultures, when we're exposed to different ideologies and ideas and thought processes. That's when you form different identities from what your parents might agree with. And I think a problem that we face is, when am I allowed to make this decision? And I think, in my opinion at least, I think children should be allowed to make, or young adults at least, should be allowed to make this decision when they start rebelling, like how Arya said. I think children rebel because they're forming their own identity. They're rebelling to break out of their parents' norms of what's right and wrong, and become your become your own person, to say, like, to put it in those words. So I think that's one thing that I wanted to talk about. And another thing, we spoke about the drinking age and whatnot, and I brought up how a lot of laws don't make sense for our generation anymore, or at least in my opinion. Like, I'm allowed to vote, I'm allowed to choose who's going to be running my country at 18, but I'm not allowed to choose if I want to put a drink in my body. I have to wait till I'm 25 in Delhi. So when we think of these things logically, they don't make sense. but but that's also our opinion as a younger generation. I don't know if the other panelists disagree with me on this, and I'm sure there are lots of other young adults who'd say, no, I think you should wait till you're 25 to drink. And then you also find things like how a man should be 21 before he gets married, but a female has to be 18. A lot of these, I think this also comes with identity. Like, my identity is that I believe I should be able to choose, whether when I'm an adult, I should be able to choose what I want to do when I want to do it. So I think small things like this over time will change. I think organic change always takes place. But we were talking about parenting, and I think parents should acknowledge the fact that our generation is different, that we shouldn't count age for our generation on, like, based on years, but more on our experiences, because I think our generation has a lot more experiences, and we shouldn't be you shouldn't say I'm 17 so I'm not allowed to do this. I think it's different for our generation to a certain extent.
Right. Yeah, very well said. So, uh, when you spoke about parents allowing their children to have their own identity, uh, to what extent do you think parents should allow them to have their identity, and from what age probably? Like, you always said that they should be allowed as a child, as a teenager, but do you think that there's any particular age, like at 13, when they become a teen, allow them to have their own identity? And what if that identity is harmful? What if as a teenager you may not realize how it's going to impact you or affect you? And let's assume in this case that your parents have the best intentions for you. So what would you do then?
Yeah, I don't think there's a particular age at which you can say, I'm 10 now, I should be able to do this. But one more thing, you mentioned that, I think parents always have their best intention for their children. I don't think parents ever want to harm their children. I don't think parents say, don't go out at night because they want to restrict you, because they don't want you to have fun. I think parents have their own idea of what is okay and what's not okay, what's safe and what's not safe. And I think parents always do what they believe is best for their children. But I think there comes a point in your child's life where you should acknowledge the fact that sometimes you should let your child make mistakes. Sometimes maybe your child does know better. Sometimes the only way your child will learn is if they mess up themselves. I mean, it's always like that. I think even when you're learning something, you try it, you get it wrong, and then you know next time not to do it. Much rather than someone telling you, don't press the red button, and you're always tempted to. But I think that's also a line. There's certain things that are dangerous and you should not do. Like when it comes to, like, let's take drugs as an example. I think experimenting when you're a teenager, when you're a young adult, is all great and fine. But I think everyone should know where to stop. That line they should draw for themselves. And I think parents should let children become their own person as and when they're growing up. Ever since you're a little child, you'll pick up on things, you'll want to do certain things differently, or you'll want to conform to certain things. And I think parents should just kind of let that be, instead of trying to correct children and telling them to fit into society's norms and to do things a certain way because that's how it's always done. Instead, letting children grow to be their own person. And along the way, yes, parents will always correct their children. When it comes to safety, for example, that's where parents will always put their child's safety first. So I think there's that line where parents will decide what is detrimental for their child and what is letting their child grow and become their own person. So I think that's the line.
Right. Anya, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, well, I think that this entire discussion has a very unique outlook in the sense that because we're living in the 21st century, we're going through industry 4.0. So I think the challenges that parents now have are very different. So in order for I spoke to a friend like a couple of years ago, and I remember she narrated the story to me and told me that a group of girls went on an online like internet sex chat and posted the address of a girl who they thought who they no longer considered a friend. And like it was like a obviously like a huge case of cyberbullying that blew out of proportion. Now in a world like this is status quo, this is what we live in a world like this. You can't potentially tell your parents that, okay, you know what, let me be my own person, I'll be my own person when I want to be. So it places very very unique challenges that even they have never dealt with. So I think it just comes back to the heart of what I'd said, like when I first started off. It's this idea of in like telling your children what is the right way to, and obviously right, there is no right or wrong, but how to interact with your external environment in ways that's not just harmful to you but to other people as well. Because you can't tell a parent that don't worry about my like your child's safety when like some other child is responsible for like in this example that I gave, when some other child is responsible for like causing like potential like and tangible threats of safety to another child. So like it's very easy for us, and like this is to all the parents on the panel, like it's very easy for us as panelists and young adults to say that don't worry, like teach us well and trust your instincts. But the world out there isn't as rosy as like we're overplaying like. And I think the internet is the greatest thing that's ever happened to mankind. So I'm in no way like trying to bring down the efficacy of that, but I just think it's easy for us without being parents to like take part in this debate. But I think the issue is a lot more like complex, and we're like to some extent we could be oversimplifying it. So yeah, I think I'd really like to listen to what the panelists, like the audience has to say.
Anya, I'm sorry, but I think we lost you towards the end. If you could just repeat what you said in the last 10, 15 seconds, that'd be great.
Oh, I just said it's very easy for me to sit on my armchair and like tell like parents how to parent because there is no handbook to parenting. So from the parents and like in the audience, I want to like hear what they have to say, especially about things like, relationships. Like when is it okay for me as a child to tell you that I'm like engaging in this behavior and this activity? So when is it all right for them to like be able to accept these things?
Right. So I think this has been said at the right time because it's the end of the hour as well. It's about a minute past 7, and we will be moving into answering a couple of questions. But before that, let me just go over what all panelists have said. So it began with Anya talking about and rather stressing on privacy and safety rather than a privacy or safety situation. We had Sahil talking about how self-awareness is really important, both for teens as well as their parents, or rather young adults and their parents. And we had Arya talking about how culture plays an important role and how we can learn from other cultures as well. And finally, we had Tia, who spoke about the role of identity, how one's identity is defined, and how they should be allowed and have the autonomy to decide their own identity without fearing repercussions from what other people in society would think or what their parents would want their child to be, which I think has really set the tone to uh, open the Q&A session, because we have a couple of questions that are all related to our discussion. So could I please invite Nurain Fazil to please unmute and ask your question? All right. So we had a pretty good question. Do you think this is post the entire panel? Do you think there's a correlation between socioeconomic status and desire for autonomy?
I'd love to answer that actually. Is that all right?
Please do.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, I was in the middle of something, but go ahead, Arya. Go for it.
I do absolutely believe there is a link between socioeconomic status and desire for autonomy. In fact, I think there's a link between socioeconomic status and the amount of autonomy that people are provided. Like over here, I think I threw around the word Indian culture a little bit. I think I should have been a little more specific. I think it very specifically means people of a certain socioeconomic class. Because if you think about it, a lot of like laborers and stuff, the children work far earlier than most of us. They support their family far younger age. That provides a certain degree of autonomy to them. To a lot of people at the age of 17, a lot of parents or some parents are control of their children's relationships, whereas several girls in several communities in India get married at that age. And just, I think social-economic class to determine a desire for, I don't know if Maslow's hierarchy is the best way to describe this, but it's somewhat low on the priority list. If a person is still fighting to have their basic needs met, fighting for survival, they're not really going to want that amount of individual choice. So I get that a lot of the points that we are bringing up are somewhat privileged perspectives on the matter. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. But I think that's also sort of evidence on how, when you talk about India, it's not a blanket term, because a lot of people even within India have very different realities and very different amounts of autonomy and circumstances within which to exercise that autonomy than we do.
All right. Yeah, thank you. I think that's pretty much answered the question. There was a question from Alok. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. This is a general question to the panelist. Do they believe they have enough autonomy?
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question. So we could go one by one. Anya, do you think you have enough autonomy?
Yeah, I think I have like a fair amount of autonomy, but there are some like aspects of my life I wish I had more autonomy.
All right, I sure do hope your parents are listening in on this call. All right, what about you, Tia?
I think I'm heavenly, like really blessed to say that I think I have a lot of autonomy in my life. My parents give me a lot of freedom to make my own choices and to be my own person. I think my dad's listening. Thanks, Dad.
All right, so what about you, Sahil?
Yeah, I think I've also come from a background where my parents have always been very supportive and given me the opportunity to explore. Um, so yeah, I think I am quite happy with the freedoms that I've been given, and I think more importantly that I feel comfortable sharing with them stuff like my relationships with other people and the things that I'm interested in doing. And I think that trust comes from the knowledge that they will talk about it with me and not just say um, no or like explain to me their reasoning behind it. So yeah, I think I'm quite happy with.
That's great to hear. And you, Arya?
Same, no complaints here.
No complaints. All right. Even I can affirm that to a very, very large degree, I have no complaints and I have a good amount of autonomy. And I think we can move on to the next question. Miss Priya Rao, if you're there, I'm not sure if you're there.
Hi everyone. So nice to see all of you on screen. Okay, so my question is, I need your help, guys. My almost 11-year-old daughter wants to create an Instagram account, and she says she's going to keep it private. And so far, I haven't given her permission to put any pictures which have her on in the picture. Right? She can take pictures of our dogs or our, nature or something and put it. So, but she wants me to give her permission to put her own photos there. So what should I do? I'll tell you what I'm scared of. I'm scared of the fact that those photos are always going to be there. They can even be accessed by her college advisors to check on what she's done in the past and stuff like that. And an 11-year-old child may not always make the best decisions. So not just about best decisions. It's like, you can't judge them in a different context to where they're operating right now. So what would be your advice for me?
All right, that's a really interesting question, and thank you for posing that to us. It just shows that I think we've been pretty successful in trying to convince you all that despite that some of us are even under the age of 18, we have some amount of expertise or at least opinions that are valued. So it's a great question that we have. But to answer it, anyone's interested.
Could I, Sanjay?
Please do go ahead.
Yeah, so I think at the heart of Ms. Rao's question is that does the concept of privacy actually exist in the online realm? Because of course there is like privacy settings on Instagram and there is like end-to-end encryption, but once things are on the digital space, as Ms. Rao pointed out, it's there forever. So I think like I understand like the concern, and I think like Miss Rao, I think what you should be looking at is Instagram's privacy policy. I think that's where you should start. I think you should understand how much autonomy Instagram has over that picture and how much control the individual who's posting that picture has over the picture. I think that's the starting point, and then you make a decision on whether or not you want your child to engage with that. So it's crucial to understand. I think that's the stepping stone for implementing any form of technology or any form of like social media into your life, is that you understand the privacy policies of those companies. You understand what they're going to do with that data, what they're going to do with that picture. Are they going to store it forever? Is there a way to delete it once it's deleted? Is it going to still be there on their database? Look at like specifically with respect to Instagram in this matter, and then make a decision. So like it's not like a one size fits all approach.
Right. Anya, I'm not sure. I think we seem to have lost you, but we did hear you, I think, end with it's not a one size fits all approach. So
if I could add something.
yeah, I was actually going to pose a question to Priya, because Priya spoke a lot about allowing children to form their own identity. So do you think that in Ms. Rao's child's case, she should or he should be allowed to form their own identity?
I think, Ms. Rao, I understand entirely where you're coming from, because my parents had, I remember when I was 11, when I was in 6th grade, basically, all my friends were on Instagram and I was throwing a fit saying, I need to make an account. This is not okay. I want to have my Instagram account. And my mom sat me down and she explained to me that what I post online will be there forever. And I think now that I've been on Instagram for a while, I realize how it takes, you have to sit down and actually think before you post something, because a simple screenshot of that post means it will be with someone forever. Whether you delete it after that, it might be gone from Instagram, but that person will have a screenshot of it. And I think that's where it comes to waiting until you feel like, well, your child or whatever can make that decision and say that they're okay with people knowing this part of their life. They're okay with sharing this much with everyone. And I think I think it's part of building someone's identity, being on like places like being on social media like Instagram. You make friends, you're in contact with people all the time. But I think when it comes to posting pictures, it's more of a, I think it needs to be carefully thought through before you do something like that, because if it is something that you later feel like you don't want people seeing or don't want people knowing, it can become an issue. And I think when it comes to social media, it's quite delicate because it can be very helpful, but it can also be very detrimental. Like I have a lot of friends that have been in situations on social media where they now regret, they now look upon like with like badly, they don't feel comfortable about those situations. So I think when it comes to social media, it's a very, like how Anya said, there's no like one solution fits all. It depends completely on the person and on the situation to make a decision. Yeah.
Right. And if I could add in my 2 cents to this. So, another thing that I am not sure if the panelists have acknowledged here is that the legal age to join social media is 13. And in the case of Miss Rao's daughter, she's still only 11. So, a question that, and I'm personally of the opinion that even though it may not be something favorable, or say you're fine with someone joining social media at the age of 11, at the end of the day, it's still not legal to do so. And as long as the law is not on your side, I'd rather not try and go over the law and try and circumvent it by putting in a fake date of birth. For example, I joined social media on my 13th birthday. So January 20th, 2015 was the day I joined most social media. So that's personally what I feel is would be the right thing to do. But at the same time, there is also a question of, is the age of 13 even valid? Or should it be lesser than 13, or should it be more than 13? Because I think in the case of social media and how we had some panelists talking about how it's literally consuming you, um, it's a very interesting, it's a little bit of a moral dilemma. And Arya or Sahil, do you want to chip in? What do you think,
May I just
especially about this?
very quickly just provide my perspective? I know the legal aspect should be the last word on this, so I'm not going to not going to address that. Just one thing, Ms. Rao, that I do feel might be somewhat helpful is if and a lot of this is knowing your child, as Tia mentioned, and knowing what you know of her character and whether you feel that their character might be such that you would be able to handle it responsibly. But if the discussion ever does come up, I think possibly a more productive discussion might be not necessarily whether or not the child should be on social media, and more about providing the child with enough information to make proper decisions, informed decisions about what sort of posts they're posting. Enough information about the sort of dangers of the online environment, and the need to think a lot before you post anything, as Tia mentioned. I don't have any perspectives on when this should be done, but I do believe that that might be somewhat more helpful than just deciding when the child might be prepared.
Right. Sahil, do you have
Yeah,
any?
just a very quick thing. Parents, please also keep in mind that we have a lot of social pressures. I personally didn't have social media until very late, but I know that a lot of my friends would have been very, very upset if their parents would have just said, since the legal age is 13, you cannot have an account, even though all their friends had an account. So just please keep this in mind when you're talking to your kids, that there are a lot of kind of social pressures as well, and the desire to fit in, that maybe you should also consider when we're making that decision.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like I mentioned, my whole thing of getting on social media was because all of my friends were, and my parents said no. So I think while you're making decisions, like Sahil said, it's important to take into account what your child is thinking and why your child wants to do something like that, why your child is considering it. I think that's also important because I think sometimes saying no can be more harmful than actually letting them, do it and find like make their own mistakes. I think not letting them can be more detrimental sometimes.
Absolutely. So With that, I think we spent a fair amount of time on this question, which is indeed a really good question, and thank you for that once again. Now we have another request from Mayur, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question here is this. The question becomes, what is acceptable behavior, which is what is your um, teenage romance, holding hands okay, is kissing okay, is going out on date alone okay, is being left in the room alone okay, and is it okay for you to drink just beer at 17, or is it okay for you to drink whiskey at 19? So what do you consider, you guys consider acceptable versus what I as a parent would consider acceptable? I think there's definitely a dichotomy there, and that's where the conflict comes in.
Right. So I think a really good question again. Would anyone like to try and tackle it?
If I could,
Absolutely.
I think like when you talk about generational gaps, um, I think there's always going to be that point at which your children feel like it's time that they can do something and you feel like it's not. When you brought up like the whole thing of should you be allowed to drink beer when you're 17 or like breezers maybe, I think, I mean, legally you're not allowed to, but I think it's up to parents. It's up to parents to say that if they feel like their child is responsible enough, I guess, or whatnot. I think parenting is such a, like, you have to mold it to your child and you have to mold it to your child's situation, that there's no one answer. But I think it's up to, I think when parents like trust their children, they like have faith that their children know that they can make the right decisions when they come to a point where they feel like they can let their children go out, and they know that even if their children are put in a situation, that they will make the right decision, that they will think it through before they do anything. I think that's when you start allowing your child to do things, because that's when you know that they will be responsible. And I think that comes with everything that we've spoken up like up till now, that comes with giving your child freedom, allowing your child to make mistakes, allowing your child to grow as a person. I think that's when you start to like become your child's friend more than become a person in your child's life that's saying no all the time, or becoming the controlling figure in your child's life. Like my parents did this thing where they never said no to me, but instead they always sat me down and explained to me why they don't want me to do something. And 95% of the time, like when I thought of it from their perspective, I realized that, okay, I understand why it doesn't make sense to let me go out at 10 in the night alone. Like when you reason out with your child and explain to your child why you're making a certain decision, they're more likely to agree with you than if your child comes and asks you something and you say no, and they ask you why and you're saying because I'm saying so, rather than giving them an actual reason.
I think that's true. And we'll move on to the next question now, because we have a lot of questions. And I think next time onwards, we should have a question and answer session that's at least as long as our discussion, because I'm not sure we'll be able to go over everything. So Aaron, Joseph, do you want to unmute yourself? All right. If not, I can read out the question. It's obvious that the answer to these concerns you all have raised is to find a balance between overt parenting and child privacy. So, what are each of your suggestions on how the parent should find that balance, and how that child should find that balance too? What are some of the practices you suggest will lead to that balance? Anyone?
Sure. Could I just start here? So I think there are two main maybe recommendations. So firstly, just a quick thing that I'm no means an expert. I'm just giving my opinions. But I think there are two really big things from the parents' perspective that should be considered before putting any regulations. The first is I think the parents should have a very, very good understanding of where the reason for that regulation is coming from. I think if the parents, I think a lot of the times, for example, this helps weed out the cases where the reason for a regulation is maybe cultural norms. If you I feel like if a parent cannot come up with a concrete reason why they think this restriction is important for the child, and if they're unable to explain that in a way that the child can understand, then there's some disconnect going on there, or there's some issue with where that's coming from. So I think first thing is understanding why the underlying reason behind it and where it's coming from. And I think the second thing is making sure that if you have some non-negotiables as a parent, they are limited in scope. I think um, maybe marking out the maybe few things that you believe are the most important things that you want to regulate, and then allowing more freedom in other aspects is really important. Because I think if a child trusts, like if there's not excess amounts of regulation, and if a child trusts that the parent will only regulate when it's something that the parent feels is very, very important or very crucial, then I think they're likely to be a lot more receptive than if the parent is just kind of interjecting in all of their decisions. So I think understanding the underlying reasons behind the restrictions, and B, making sure that they're limited in scope to the things that are most important to the parent. I think those are two important things. But it would be great if some other panelists could talk about the child's perspective, because I don't think I really covered
If I may, oh, okay, Arya, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I just wanted to like add saying I think communication's honestly the key. I think talking to your child and understanding where they're coming from and telling your child where you're coming from, I think that's in my opinion at least that's what worked for my family. That's how we found balance, being able to explain why you want to do something, and I think that's also where your child will find balance too, because there have been a lot of times I wanted to do something, but I haven't been able to put into words or explain and have a solid reason for why I want to. And I think that's when your child will also realize that, okay, fine, it's stupid. I don't really want to. I can't really tell myself why I want to. Maybe I don't want to. So I think that having like a space in an environment where you feel comfortable explaining to your child what's happening and your child feels comfortable explaining to you, I think that's key.
I absolutely agree with that, actually. And I think there's just a few things I want to talk about how to establish that sort of communication. I think, firstly, probably the most important thing is all restrictions should be constructive and not punitive, because I think the absolute best way to stop your kid from ever telling you about anything is to punish them for being honest with you, or to punish them for making a decision that teenagers are usually liable to make. Um, I also think that details, people have touched upon this a lot, but the details and the reasons for the restrictions should be made absolutely clear. Sometimes providing information is far, far more helpful than actually providing restrictions. Just to give an example on my own, substance usage is a very discussed topic in my family. My parents have actually said at some points of time, if you want to do substance, go ahead. But I wouldn't, because I know very well all of the dangers of using substance. I know that at this point. And I think the same principle can be applied to a lot of other things with regard to parenting. Just as long as the kid knows the dangers, they know they know to restrict themselves. And also what's important, I think, is knowing your own child. There's no single formula for this. It's essentially knowing what sort of behaviors your child is liable to take, and constructing any restrictions around that.
Right. And so just to move on, since we're limited by time, I'm going to be combining a couple of questions and posing them as one. So we know it's proven by science that full maturity in people is generally achieved by the age of around 24, or at least in the early 20s. So do you think that, for example, young adults should be allowed to drink, and at what age should they be allowed to drink? Keeping in mind that maturity is achieved only at 24, and drinking at a younger age can also impact brain development and whatnot. And it's not only limited to drinking, it's also a whole bunch of topics. You're not the most mature that you can be as an individual until you're probably in your mid 20s. So do you think that, and this is, I think, a great question, because it essentially puts our entire debate into a dilemma. Like, has anything that we have discussed today, does it have to hold any value, and if yes, why? If not, why?
Sanjit, can I add something on the point of substances?
Yes, please do go ahead.
Right. So there are two approaches, like the way and cut me off if I'm like taking too much time, but there are two ways to look at this, right? One is the approach that Arya said, where you sort of normalize it with your children and you start like maybe offering them a drink once in a while when you're drinking. That's one approach. And in that aspect, like we hope that that the child sort of understands like where the parent, like what's normal and like how to drink, etc. Whereas the second approach is that, like the second way of looking at it is that now that you've normalized this in your household, your child thinks that because this is the norm, he won't get a thrill from just drinking. So now he or she might look into like doing hard drugs because that's their aspect of thrill, because that hasn't been normalized. So does this normalization actually work? Because like there are two ways the child could react. One is that, okay, this is already normal, this is not exciting anymore because my parents are doing it with me. And the second, like the dichotomy is that now like a kid could also look at it and say that, okay, it's time for me to do hard drugs because this is the only source of excitement that I have, because drinking is normal at home anyway.
If I may like offer a rebuttal to that, I think the aim is not to normalize it but like to normalize talking about it. Not to say drinking underage is okay or like doing drugs is okay or like all other things, but more to say that you can talk about it with me. Like, you know, if you tell me that, okay, fine, I want to try a drink, that we can still have that conversation, and but not make like underage drinking normal or make things like that normal, but to make it normal to talk about it.
Right. And so it's an interesting counter point of view that you have provided over there. So I think we can move on to, I think, one of the last questions for the day. So I think this is by Rachita N, if you're here with us.
Hi guys, hi, good evening. I'm going to just quickly explain. First of all, it's been an enlightening session. Thank you all for your opinions. This is something I think as a parent and as an adult, I have a very vague understanding about teenagers and being unnecessarily independent. And I think you've kind of put those thoughts in a very logical manner, allowing me to giving me a new perspective that teens can actually be sensible and are not always ruled by emotions and hormones. Yes, my question is specifically in relation to tattoos. It's a sore topic at home. It's nice to see none of you are scarred, but we refer to tattoos as a permanent mark of temporary insanity. That's how we look at tattoos. My question is not specifically on whether parents should be involved on whether parents should be allowed should be involved in allowing their children to get tattoos, but more in terms of what the child or what the young adult may choose to ink on themselves. At this age, I believe a lot of teens want to make a statement, want to show their unique identity. In the end, I suspect they end up looking like they have a chip on the shoulder, which is quite unnecessary.
Yeah.
And probably not a good idea. I'm just curious to hear your opinion.
So would anyone like to take that question up?
If I may.
Yes,
Or Anya, do you want to? I think, I mean, my parents have the same perspective of tattoos. They believe they're like really permanent, and if you're making a decision like that, you should be in like your full consciousness and you should be thinking about it for years. But I think tattoos are also something that are very personal. It's on your body, you're choosing for it to be on your body. And I think at a point, maybe like tattoos are legal, I think only after 18. You're not allowed like legally to get them before. If I'm wrong, correct me, anyone? No, I'm right. Okay.
Consent, you can get it even.
Oh, really? Okay. but like to make that decision on your own, you have to be above 18. And I think the whole point of getting tattoos is also part of like creating your own identity, of like expressing yourself. So I think there will come a point in like everyone's life where they might want to get a tattoo, and if they feel like it's the right thing for them to do, I think when you're old enough, you're allowed to take that decision for yourself. But I think as a parent, you're always allowed to express to your child your opinion of it and your belief of it. And like, if as a parent you truly believe it's not it, you can always explain to them your opinion. Like I said, communication is key. So if you explain to them why exactly you feel like it's not it, and they'll explain to you why they want to, I think you'll reach a point where you come to a consensus.
Right. So, with that, even though we have a couple of questions that have gone unanswered, I'm really sorry, but as per BIC policy of staying punctual, we have to end this despite it being 2 minutes late. So, thank you all for attending. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. This is only episode 1 of this new series. We have a couple of more planned in the pipeline. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please do send us feedback at the BIC email ID. Our website's www.bangaloreinternationalcenter.com. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and all the social medias we spoke about today. I hope you all enjoyed it. And once again, thank you for attending. And I think great job to all my co-panelists.
Having grown up in a time when it was, and to some extent it still is, an undesirable trait to be opinionated, boy, am I grateful what to have been privy to this rich and informed conversation, which I can say with some authority really has set new standards to panel discussions in general, and has definitely begun a new chapter in BIC's long history of informed and civil conversations. If this is what you teenagers talk about, contemplate about, and this is how you do it, then I hope all adults watching have been taking notes. And I personally can't wait for you all to take over and run the world already. Thank you, Anya, Arya, Sahil, Sanjit, and Tia for kicking this series off in such style and poise. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us, and looking forward to more of this. See you next time, and good night, everyone.